Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The shir is Leiluy Nishmat, Daniella, Shaina, Aleha Hashalom, Bas Yehoshua, Falik Sheyichya, when the Nishmat should have an Aliyah, and Allah Yidin Ayashia. Welcome back to our Thursday evening weekly class. For the next couple of weeks, with Hashem's help, as we are in the weeks between Pesach and Shavuos, we will study together some of the insights and some of the ideas specifically with regard to the mitzvah of Sfiras Omer. With Hashem's help, we'll go through it from different angles. There's much to it. It's a very unique and interesting mitzvah, and with Hashem's help, we'll get into some of it. So let's start with this part, a very famous part, but nevertheless worthwhile exploring. In articulating the mitzvah that one should count what we call Sfiras Omer, the counting of the Omer, the Torah says, "Usfartem lochem mimochras haShabbos," which means that one should begin counting from the day after Shabbos. When is Shabbos? The Torah doesn't say, or at least on a literal level, it's not clear. The Torah just says, start counting from the day after Shabbos. All right, the Torah goes on to say, "Miyoim haviyachem esomer hatnufa," from the day that you bring the korban Omer. From the day that you bring the korban Omer, that's when you start counting. But again, it's not clear exactly in the Torah when do we begin counting. All the Torah says is mimochras haShabbos, from the day after Shabbos. So the Gemara discusses this. The Gemara proves from various psukim and various sources that the meaning here of the word Shabbos is the first day of Pesach. And the Torah means that we should start counting as in fact we do, from the day after the first day of Pesach, right? So this year, the first day of Pesach was Sunday. We start counting from Sunday night, Monday, and we start counting 77 weeks, 49 days, and the 50th day is the Yom Tov of Shavuos. But the Torah doesn't say explicitly that you should count from the day after the first day of Pesach. Instead, the Torah just says from the day after Shabbos. Now, in the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara, there were very famously a group of Jews referred to by the Talmud, referred to by the Gemara as Baitusim. They were called Baitusim because they were students of a sage called Baitus. His students were called Baitusim, the followers of Baitus. They were in close proximity with a group of Jews called the Tzedukim. They were called Tzedukim because they were students of an individual called Tzadok. Tzadok and Baitus were two sages in the days of the Mishnah. If we have time, we'll get into some of their history of where they came from. But be it as it may, their students were called Tzedukim and Baitusim. The Tzedukim, the Talmud tells us, and the Baitusim in this case specifically, the Tzedukim and the Baitusim did not really believe in the oral Torah. They said, the rabbis made it up. They didn't believe in it. They didn't follow it. They didn't feel that that was a correct interpretation of the biblical section of Torah itself. They believed in the written Torah. They believed that the written Torah was given by Hashem to Moshe Rabbeinu and passed down through the generations. That they believed in. They didn't believe in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, in much of the commentary, in much of the application. That they refused to accept. Written Torah, yes. The part that comes from Hashem, yes. The part that comes from the divine, yes. The part that the rabbis interpreted, that part is Rabbi Babel. They said, we're not interested in that. They didn't believe in it. So they said, the Gemara, the Baitusim had a very interesting relationship with the mitzvah of Sfiras Omer. Because on the one hand, the mitzvah is written clearly in the Torah. Usfartem lochem mimochras haShabbos. On the other hand, the Torah doesn't say you should start counting from the day after the first day of Pesach. The Torah says you should start counting from the day after Shabbos. The rabbis explained that this refers to the day after the first days of Pesach. The Baitusim refused to accept that. They said cannot be. Mimochras haShabbos, said the Baitusim, means from the day after Shabbos. And so they would always wait for a Sunday, and only when the first Sunday, when Pesach began, they would wait for the first Sunday, and as soon as Sunday would come, that's when they would start counting Sfiras Omer. As a result, by the way, the Baitusim always celebrated Shavuos on Sunday. Of course, remember that in Eretz Yisrael, Shavuos is a one-day Yom Tov. So the Baitusim always celebrated Shavuos on Sunday. It would never fall out on any other day of the week, according to the Baitusim, because they always started counting on a Sunday. That's how Sfiras Omer works. Shavuos falls out on the day that you start counting. This year we started counting on a Monday. Shavuos will be on a Monday. We started counting this year that's right, the first day of Pesach was Sunday. We started counting on Monday. So Shavuos this year falls out on Monday. The Baitusim always had Shavuos on Sunday because they always started counting on Sunday. Never failed. All right. The rabbi said that doesn't make any sense. It's not what it's referring to. It's referring to the first day of Pesach. Besides, the rabbi said to the Baitusim, if you say it means Sunday, then what's it got to do b'chlal? What's it got to do b'chlal with Pesach? Who said it's the Sunday of Pesach? Maybe it's the Sunday in Mar Cheshvan. How do you know? All right. The rabbis provided many proofs from the verses that their interpretation was correct and the Baitusim's interpretation was incorrect. Be it as it may, the Talmud in Masechta Menachos records the following conversation between Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the sages of the Mishnah, and one of the Baitusim. Says this Baitus to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, I'll prove to you that our interpretation is correct and Shavuos must always be celebrated on a Sunday. What's the proof? He says to him, Moshe Rabbeinu oyev Yisrael hoya. The Baitus tells Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, this heretic, tells Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Moshe Rabbeinu was a great lover of Jews. V'yodeya, and Moshe was aware, Shatzeres Yom Echad, that Nebach Shavuos is only one day. Pesach is 7 days in Eretz Yisrael. Sukkot is 8 days in Eretz Yisrael. Shavuos is only 1 day. What a measly Yom Tov. 1 day that before you turn around, the whole thing is over. So a Yom Tov that's so small, that's so short, Omad v'tikno achar Shabbos. Moshe Rabbeinu instituted and insisted that it should always be on a Sunday. Kedei sheyehu Yisrael misangin shnei yomim. So the Jews can at least enjoy it for 2 days. Nebach, what kind of a Yom Tov is this? I mean, think about how much preparation goes into a Yom Tov, how much anticipation, how much work, how much shopping and cooking and cleaning and all the rest of it. And then the whole thing is over in 1 day. I heard one of the Hasidic Rebbes in Eretz Yisrael, and after he finished the first Seder, after he finished the first and only Seder in Eretz Yisrael, he said to his Hasidim, he said, I'm kind of jealous of the people in Chutz La'aretz that they get a chance to do a second Seder. They get a chance to do it a second Yom Tov. Hasidic Rebbe, he wanted to do it again. So at least in Chutz La'aretz, Shavuos is a 2-day Yom Tov, at least. But in Eretz Yisrael, it's a 1-day Yom Tov. So the Baitus tells Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, 1 day Yom Tov, the whole thing. We count for it and we wait for 49 days. And then 1 day, boom, you read from the Torah, you daven mincha, you go home and it's over. Moshe Rabbeinu oyev Yisrael hoya, says the Baitus. Moshe Rabbeinu loves Jews. He wants them to enjoy at least for 2 days. What are you going to make it 2 days? You can't make a 1 Yom Tov into a 2-day Yom Tov. Omad v'tikna achar Shabbos, and Moshe Rabbeinu made that it should always fall out on Sunday. So the Jews will go directly from Shabbos into Yom Tov, and at least they'll be able to enjoy themselves for 2 days. All right, the argument is difficult to understand, but this is what the Baitus says. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai responded. And he says to this individual, Baitus, he says to him, really? You think Moshe Rabbeinu was such a great lover of Jews? You think Moshe Rabbeinu was such an oyev Yisrael? Let me ask you a question, says the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to this Baitus. You believe in Chumash, yes? You believe in Torah Shebechsav, in the written Torah, yes? You know what it says there in Parshas Dvarim? It says, Achad osar yoymei choyrev, derech har seir ad kodesh barnea. That it was an 11-day journey for the Jews from Har Sinai, from where they received the Torah, until they got to Kadesh Barnea, which was basically by the borders of Eretz Yisrael, was an 11-day journey. All right, the commentaries add that if you do the calculation, even that journey they managed to do in 3 days. Be it as it may, 11-day journey from Har Sinai, where they received the Torah, to the borders of Eretz Yisrael, 11 days. Says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to the Baitus, if Moshe Rabbeinu loved the Jews so much, why did he tarry? Why did he make them delay in the desert for 40 years? What, he was uncomfortable to ask for directions? 40 years? An 11-day journey. Seems, says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to the Baitus, that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't love the Jews so much. If he would have loved them as much as you think, he would have made the journey much faster. After all, it's an 11-day journey. No need for it to take 40 years. Okay. Now, this is what it says in the Gemara. Now, you study this and you got to wonder, what in heaven's name is going on here? First of all, why are we talking about whether Moshe Rabbeinu loves the Jews or not? After all, the Baitusim's argument had nothing to do with Moshe Rabbeinu. The Baitusim's argument had to do with the meaning of the word Mimachras HaShabbos. And what's Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's answer? That Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't love the Jews. Was it Moshe Rabbeinu's decision that the Jews should spend 40 years in the desert and not go in after an 11-day journey? What does the Talmud really mean? And what is the deeper meaning? What is the deeper significance of this argument whether Shavuos has to fall out on a Sunday or not? So there's a beautiful explanation on this. We'll try to explain it, at least one part of the insight. The Baitusim, they worshipped, so to speak. They studied Torah Shebechsav. They said everything that comes from Hashem is divine. They said everything that comes directly from above is holy and spiritual and divine and godly and perfect. They said once human beings get involved, things start to get messy. If you say the words of Hashem as they are, holy and pure and perfect, that's Torah Shebechsav. Torah Shebechsav is perfection as Hashem intended it. It's good. Once you start getting into the rabbi's interpretation and how they understand it and how they explain it, and they start arguing back and forth, now you're mixing in the human touch. The human touch, the Baitusim said, is by nature imperfect. No human being can ever understand the ways, the meaning of Hashem perfectly. Torah Shebal Peh, the oral Torah, the Baitusim argued, is human and therefore by nature fallible. Torah Shebechsav, the written Torah, is holy and perfect. The rabbis argued, the Chachamim of the Mishnah and the Gemara argued. They had a fundamental philosophical argument with the Baitusim. They said to the Baitusim, you're right that only Hashem is perfect. And you're right that human beings are always fallible. But Hashem gave us the Torah not just to put on a bookshelf, not just to read as is, not just to repeat the words exactly as Hashem gave them to us, but Hashem wants us to grapple and study and understand the Torah with our own puny, limited human minds. And when we do so, when we grapple with the Torah ideas in our own fallible minds, that's part of Torah too. Because that's the way Hashem wants us to study and analyze the Torah, our own human fallible experiences in grasping and understanding the Torah. This is also a part of Torah. The Baitusim said, that's not Torah. That's our attempt to understand the Torah. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong. The Torah is the wisdom of Hashem. The Chachamim said, yes, the Torah is the wisdom of Hashem. But Hashem wants his wisdom to be studied by mere mortals who with their own minds will try to grasp the intention of Hashem. And Hashem has empowered us that when we do this to the best of our limited abilities, according to the rules of Torah, the conclusions we come to and the understandings we have, that those thought processes of us human beings, mere mortals, those thought processes become part of Torah too. You see, they argued whether or not Hashem had actually empowered human beings to make their grappling, their struggling with the Torah ideas, whether Hashem wanted that to be part of the Torah too. The Tzedukim and the Baitusim started off as very noble, intended individuals. They said the Torah of Hashem is holy, the Torah of human beings is not. The Chachamim said the Torah of human beings is also holy so long as they're doing their best to understand Hashem's Torah, not because the human beings are powerful, but because Hashem is powerful enough to empower the human beings to understand it as Hashem wanted them to. Now, we find something very interesting with regard to the difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov. Shabbos, the Gemara says, is Makad Sheva Kaima. Shabbos is every seventh day of the week. That's the way it is. Shabbos never changes. Shabbos doesn't need a Bezdin to make it holy. Every seventh day is Shabbos, and that's the end of it. Yom Tov, on the other hand, depends not on the day of the week, but on the day of the month. And the day of the month, Rosh Chodesh, is established inherently by a Bezdin, by a human Bezdin. When a human Bezdin declares a particular day to be Yom Tov, to be Rosh Chodesh, when a human Bezdin declares a particular day to be Rosh Chodesh, that becomes Rosh Chodesh, and 15 days later will be Sukkot, it will be Pesach, or will be the appropriate Yom Tov. Shabbos is seen, if you will, as a Yom Tov that always comes from Hashem. Yom Tov is a Yom Tov, Pesach, Sukkot, even Shavuos, which is based on the Yom Tov of Pesach, is a Yom Tov that is generated by human beings, because Bezdin has to declare the day Rosh Chodesh in order for it to be this particular Yom Tov. So the Baitusim, they loved Shabbos because Shabbos comes from Hashem. The Baitusim loves that which comes from above because it's holy and pure and perfect. Even Shavuos, the Baitusim argued. Even Shavuos, which is dependent on the count of 49 days. The Baitusim said, if there's a way that we can organize the calendar, if there's a way that we can arrange it so that the first day of Pesach should always be a Shabbos, then let's do that. What better preparation could there be for the Yom Tov of Shavuos than to have it come right after a Shabbos? There's nothing holier than a Shabbos, a day that comes to us as a gift from Hashem. Shavuos, of course, the Yom Tov which celebrates the giving of the Torah. The Baitusim said this should be preceded by a Shabbos. For just as the Torah comes from Hashem, so Shabbos comes from Hashem. It's a most appropriate introduction that we go into Shavuos straight from Shabbos, not just so that we can enjoy Cholent and Kishka for 2 days, but even from a spiritual sense, so that we can appreciate the Yom Tov of Shavuos in the context of a day whose Kedusha is dependent and comes to us completely from the Rabbanu Shalom. And the Baitus took his argument even further. He said, if Moshe Rabbeinu loved the Jews, which he clearly did, he would want them to have Shavuos against the backdrop of a Shabbos. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai refuted his argument. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, you are not correctly understanding Moshe Rabbeinu's love for the Jewish people. It's true he loved the Jews, but not in the way you think. It's true Moshe would want the best for the Jews, but not in the way that you understand. It's true that Moshe was invested and would do everything he could to make things right for the Jews, but not the way you think, and I'll prove it to you. What's the proof? He says to him, you know, the Jewish people could have journeyed through the desert in 11 days. In fact, they did it in 3 days. How? How'd they do an 11-day journey in 3 days? Clearly, it was a miracle. Hashem miraculously carried them through this journey. He expedited the process and he rushed them through. Something went wrong, and the Jewish people ended up being in the desert for 40 years. What do you think was the purpose of the Jewish people being in the desert for 40 years? On a simple level, of course, it was a punishment. It was a punishment for the sin that took place with the spies. It was a punishment for the sin that the Jewish people didn't have enough belief and trust in Hashem to just walk into Eretz Yisrael without asking any questions. It was a punishment for the Lashon Hara which the Jews spoke against Eretz Yisrael, granted. But in Torah, we don't believe that punishments are given simply for the sake of punishment. It wasn't just given just simply as a slap on the wrist. There was a purpose. What was the purpose of the Jewish people being in the desert for 40 years? Moshe Rabbeinu Oyev Yisrael Hoya. Moshe was a lover of the Jews. He led the Jews in the desert for 40 years. Why? Or in better words, what were they doing? What were they accomplishing for those 40 years that they were in the desert? So if you read the story, a lot happened during those 40 years. The Jewish people challenged Hashem, and they challenged Moshe Rabbeinu over and over again. They sinned. Hashem wanted to destroy them. And yet each time they go through some type of spiritual crisis. Somehow, through Moshe Rabbeinu's tefillah, the Jewish people are able to overcome it, to come through it, and they end up completing their 40 years in the desert. And when it's over, the next generation goes into Eretz Yisrael. Says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, listen to me very carefully. Those 40 years were given to the Jews as an opportunity for them to work on themselves. Those 40 years were given to the Jews as an opportunity for them to do teshuvah, for them to grow and to learn from their mistakes and to rectify, to elevate themselves and to purify themselves. It was a long teshuvah process through which the Jews learned and grew and had a chance to elevate and purify and rectify and wholly sanctify themselves. When the 40 years were over, were the Jewish people perfect? Of course not. But they had been through a cleansing process. They had spent 40 years in the desert. By the time they were done, they were a people who had learned to trust in Hashem. They were a people who had learned to appreciate the gift that Hashem had given them. They were a people who appreciated what it means to have emunah, to not question. And more than anything, they were a people who had done teshuvah. And for this reason, Moshe allowed them to spend 40 years in the desert working and elevating and purifying themselves, rather than just sweeping them off their feet and rushing them into Eretz Yisrael. You know, when the Jews came to Moshe and said, let's send spies, Moshe could have said no. When the Jews came to Moshe and said, we're not ready, Moshe Rabbeinu could have said, stop it. I forced you out of Mitzrayim. I'll force you into Eretz Yisrael. He could have rammed up, could have pushed the whole thing through. He chose to give the Jewish people this opportunity, this time, to spend the time elevating, focusing, purifying themselves, and growing. You know why? Because this was also part of Hashem's plan. This was also part of the mission, this was also their shlichus, their mission that they were meant to accomplish during their lifetime. The process of a Jew grappling and growing, even as he stumbles and fails and goes from one level to the next, that was holy too. And because of that, for that purpose, Moshe kept them in the desert for 40 years. Says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to this baitus, Moshe Rabbeinu loved Jews, but not the way you think. His love for Jews motivated him to give them 40 years in the desert to work on themselves. What's the purpose, says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to the Baitusi, what's the purpose of Sfiras Omer? The purpose is that Hashem gives us 49 days where every day we wake up and we ask ourselves, how can I make myself a little bit better today than I was yesterday? When it's over after 49 levels, are we perfect? Of course not. But if we've utilized the opportunity, perhaps we're 49 steps ahead of where we were. Says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that's important too. In fact, in some ways, that's even more important. After all, what comes from Hashem is perfect, but what comes from Hashem is not us. Hashem says, I'll give you the Torah, I'll give you the written Torah, I'll give it to you in a way that's divine and perfect and pure, but then I want you to grapple with it and study, and it's sometimes succeed and it's sometimes fail. And that's your journey as Yidden. That's the purpose of 40 years in the desert. That's the purpose of Sfiras Omer. That's what all of this is meant to accomplish. In that sense, says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, even a Yom Tov, a Yom Tov is spiritually superior to Shabbos. Because Hashem looks at a Yom Tov and says, look at this. This is something that the people have done. This is something that the Jews have grasped. This is something that the Jews have searched and created this Yom Tov. Hashem says it's precious to me because it's something that the Jews have done. You know what perhaps this can be compared to? You find a lot of discussion in halacha about the relationship between there's different types of, there's what we call mitzvahs, biblical mitzvahs, rabbinic mitzvahs. Then you even have minhagim. Minhagim are customs. Customs, biblical mitzvahs are things instituted by the Torah itself. Rabbinic mitzvahs instituted by the rabbis. Then you have minhagim which are not mitzvahs. But the Jews, they, so to speak, came up with it themselves. It came by the Jews' initiative. So in halacha, you find sometimes that there's chavivus, there's preciousness, there's specialty to a minhag, even more so than a mitzvah. Why? Why is a minhag more precious in certain ways, in certain senses, more so than a mitzvah? Because when you give a person an instruction and they fulfill the instruction that you give them, that means the person is obedient. It doesn't mean the person is invested. You give a person instruction and they do it. But what about when the person initiates on their own? What about when a person comes up with a minhag that they themselves weren't instructed to do, but they were motivated to do on their own? That means the person is invested. That means the person cares. That means the person is driven. Is it the same as a mitzvah that comes from Hashem? Of course not. But is there something unique to it? If Hashem makes place for it, then yes, then this is Hashem's way of saying, I want you, the Jew, on your own. I want you to try to understand. I want you to try to fit you. I want you to be motivated. That's why the Torah itself leaves room for minhagim. And sometimes we say, minhag Yisrael Torah. The custom of Jews itself becomes Torah. There's a history, by the way, to where these tzedukim and these baitusim came from. Where did they come from? The Mishnah is a very famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, which we study this week, this Shabbos, the first Shabbos of Pirkei Avos. The Mishnah says in the first chapter of Pirkei Avos that Antigonus, one of the sages of the Mishnah, Antigonus taught his students that they should not serve Hashem as a servant who serves his teacher, who serves his master, expecting a reward. Don't be like one of those servants who serve their master intending to receive something in exchange. Serve Hashem without intention to receive anything, just what we call lishma. In Avos Rab Nosson, in a commentary on Pirkei Avos, it says that as Antigonus gave this shir and he taught his students to serve Hashem without anticipating any reward, he had two students who were sitting there, Tzadok and Baitus. And Tzadok and Baitus heard this shir, and they stood up and they walked out. They said, our teacher is nuts. Our teacher is crazy. How can you tell students to serve Hashem not for the sake of a reward? How can you tell students to serve Hashem without expecting anything in return? They said, their teacher is nuts. And if this that he's teaching is nuts, who knows what else he's teaching us that it's not, that is crazy. And they left his shir and they never came back. And from there they went off the path and they rejected all the rabbinic and oral teachings because of that. The simple meaning of the passage of Avos Rab Nosson was that these two students couldn't handle the selflessness, they couldn't handle the altruism, they couldn't handle the idealism of what their teacher was teaching. They couldn't handle a model of Judaism where you serve Hashem without expecting to get anything in return. They couldn't handle it, it was too much for them. And so they rejected it, and together with that, they rejected the rest of the teachings of the rabbis. That's the simple understanding of the Avos Rab Nosson. But there's a much deeper understanding of it. There's a much deeper layer here. Tzadok and Baitus, they themselves were lofty individuals. They had noble intentions. They heard their teacher, they heard Antigonus say, don't serve Hashem for the sake of a reward. Serve Hashem not for the sake of the reward. And Tzadok and Baitus said, we don't agree. We said, Tzadok and Baitus think that the reward that you get from Hashem for the service that you've done is greater than the service itself. What's greater? Avodas Hashem, serving Hashem, or getting reward for serving Hashem? Antigonus Ish Soichoi said, serving Hashem is greater than getting a reward for serving Hashem. In fact, you should serve Hashem not for the sake of a reward. And two students, Tzadok and Baitus, stood up and said, we disagree. Serving Hashem is something that we do, but we are mortals and we are imperfect and we are scathed. Our service can never be godly. Our service can at most be human. But when we serve Hashem, said Tzadok and Baitus, Hashem rewards us. The reward comes from Hashem. What Hashem gives us is perfect, is holy, is divine, is godly. Tzadok and Baitus said, we disagree. The service of Hashem is human. The reward from Hashem is godly. So a person should absolutely serve Hashem for the sake of a reward. Not because they're selfish, not because of their self-interest, but because that's how you get closest to Hashem. When you receive a reward that comes from Hashem. Antigonus said no. Antigonus said no. The avodas Hashem that a Jew does, despite all of their challenges and despite all of their imperfections, the avodas Hashem is higher than the schar for avodas Hashem. The avodas Hashem is higher than the reward, even though the reward comes from Hashem, and the avodah comes from the mere mortal, the mere human being. Hashem said, "L'maaseh yodecha tichsoif." Hashem said, I want to see you sweat. Hashem said, I want to see you work. I'll give you a yetzer hara. I'll give you temptations. I'll give you challenges. Show me that you care. Show me that you're invested. Show me that you're going to do your best. Hashem said, that's what I want. For perfection, I have angels up in heaven. No limit. Infinite amount of angels. They're all perfect. And none of them ever sweat. Because none of them are ever challenged. They don't have to deal with a yetzer hara. The Jewish people have a yetzer hara. And they deal and they grapple and they sweat and they toil. And sometimes they succeed and sometimes they fail. And that's avodas Hashem. And the Chachamim said, that's more important. That's greater. Yofeh sho achas, 1 hour of that is worth more than all the reward you'll get in the world to come. The reward in the world to come is beautiful. But there we're just recipients. What's more precious is a Jew's avodah, is a Jew's service. Torah shebichsav, the written Torah, there's nothing to debate in the written Torah. It is what it is, and that's the end of it. The Tzedukim and Baitusim said, there's nothing greater than that. The very word of Hashem. The Chachamim said there is something greater than that. Not because we decided that there's something greater than that, but because Hashem decided that there's something greater than that. And Hashem said, don't just repeat my words. Study, toil, work. Work on yourself. Grapple with your own yetzer hara. Succeed, fail, sometimes up, sometimes down. Do it again and again and again. Hashem says, that's where I get my nachas ruach. Shavuos celebrates the giving of the Torah. The Tzedukim and the Baitusim said, give me a Shabbos as an introduction to the giving of the Torah so we can spend Shavuos thinking about the wonderful Torah that Hashem has given us. The Chachamim said, not necessarily. Give me 7 weeks of toil before Matan Torah. Give me 7 weeks of hard work. Give me a Torah that will require me to sit and think and challenge myself over and over again. Give me a Torah that embraces my human pursuit of the understanding of Hashem with all of its imperfections and welcomes that as a part of Torah. Because Moshe Rabbeinu is an Oyev Yisrael, because Moshe Rabbeinu is a true lover of Jews, and he wants every Jew to feel a part of this experience of studying Torah. The Torah refers to the day we start counting the Sfiras Omer as Mimochras HaShabbos, the day after Shabbos. But it doesn't mean the day after Shabbos. It means the day after Yom Tov. Why is the day after Yom Tov called the day after Shabbos? Because Shabbos is what comes from Hashem and Yom Tov is what comes from us. And the rabbi said, there it is. Hashem said, you know what comes from me? You know what I want? I want Yom Tov. You know what I want? I want you to struggle and toil. I want avodas Hashem. And so even the Yom Tov of the Yid is called the Shabbos of Hashem. In the time, In the Talmud, there is a very famous story the Talmud relates, where there was once an argument in the yeshiva. They were arguing of a particular oven, whether it was tamei or tahor, pure or impure. And the rabbis gave a particular ruling, and somebody argued with them, and the person who argued said, "Let God testify on my behalf." And a voice came out of heaven and said, "He's right." And the rabbi said, "No, he's not." You know why? Because the Torah says halacha follows the majority, and we are the majority, and he's an individual, and so the halacha is like us and not like him. And the Talmud says Hashem in heaven laughed and said, "My children have been victorious over me. My children have won the argument against me. Hashem says the halacha is one way. The Beis Din argues with me, and they're right and I'm wrong," Hashem says. Because that's what it says in the Torah. Achrei rabim lahatos. You find this, by the way, even with Yom Tov. You know, I mentioned that Yom Tov is determined by the date. The date is determined by Beis Din. Beis Din declares a particular date to be Rosh Chodesh, and based on that, we know when Yom Tov is. What if Beis Din makes a mistake? What if Beis Din makes a mistake? Declares the wrong day Rosh Chodesh by mistake. The Gemara says, we learn from a pasuk, Eila moyadei Hashem asher tikru oisam. These are the moyadim of Hashem, the Yom Tovim of Hashem that you will call. Don't read it oisam, read it atem. You atem afilu shaygagim. Even if Beis Din makes a mistake, for whatever the mistake was, they declared the wrong day Rosh Chodesh by mistake. Hashem says, the Torah says, that's the day that you, Beis Din, declared Rosh Chodesh. That day is Rosh Chodesh. The heavenly Beis Din, says the Midrash, goes to Hashem and asks Hashem, when is it going to be the Yom Tov? And Hashem says, what are you asking me? Go ask Beis Din. And so they go together and they ask Beis Din. What if Beis Din made a mistake? The halacha follows their ruling anyways. What if Beis Din didn't just make a mistake? What if Beis Din, for whatever reason, intentionally got it wrong? Atem afilu shoygagim, says the Gemara. Atem afilu mazidim. Hashem doesn't want a Yiddishkeit and a Torah with a bunch of robots. Hashem doesn't want a Yiddishkeit and a Torah of a bunch of parrots where we simply repeat what it is that Hashem says. Hashem wants a Torah to be studied and to be practiced by Jews who are conflicted, by Jews who struggle, by Jews who grapple this way, that way, who'll debate it back and forth. The Mishnah, the Gemara do their best. Hashem says that's the Torah. That's the way it should be studied, and that's the way it should be celebrated. And because of this, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, it doesn't always, Shavuos doesn't always fall out after a Shabbos. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But it's always called Shabbos. Usfartem lachem mimochras haShabbos. Because the Shabbos represents the true intent and the true, what it is truly that Hashem wants. So as we go through Sfiras Omer and we count 49 days, 7 weeks, as we work on ourselves each day, as we prepare ourselves for the receiving of the Torah, it's important that we remember that the giving of the Torah is not just the day when Hashem came down on the mountain and gave us something amazing with lightning and thunder and bells and whistles. But more important than that, Matan Torah was the time when Hashem challenged every single Jew to work on themselves, to be the best version of themselves, to invest the time and the effort and the energy to study Torah, to grapple with it, to do their best to understand it in their own limited way, and to grow every single day in its pursuit and understanding. For 40 years, for 7 weeks, for 49 days, truthfully, an entire lifetime. And every part of it is precious in the eyes of Hashem and becomes very much a crucial and essential part of the Torah. Have a wonderful Shabbos and a wonderful week, a wonderful Sfiras Omer. Please God, will continue the insights next week, Thursday night, at this year. All the best.